Good evening, everybody. No fighting, please, as the evening goes on. I want us all to be a happy family of the left, despite all of Nick's efforts to rend us all asunder. Nick Cohen, I'm sure you all know, is a long-standing Observer columnist and has just written his best-selling opus, What's Left, and I'm Deborah Orr of The Independent. I think the first question I want to ask you, Nick, is again and again in the book, what comes up is the idea that the left often succumbs to the idea that one's enemy's enemy is one's friend. How do you feel about that? It's come up a lot in reviews as well.
I actually think it's a bit wrong. What I'm trying to do is write a book about how it is that liberal-minded, left-minded people go along with the movements, the ideas, the regimes of the far right. And in the 20th century, I started this book with a rather naive idea of the left in the 20th century. I thought, look, it just excused Stalin's, Mao's crimes, or people on the left did that, but there were certain things that didn't do that. Obviously, you can find people in the 20th century who did that. But in the 20th century, the idea of my enemy's enemy was less important for serious and principled people on the left, and the idea of camaraderie, fraternity, internationalism. You were a socialist, you supported other people who shared your values in other countries and in your own country. One thing my book is about the death of socialism. That's gone. And how when that goes, then you do get my enemy's enemy is my friend. You do get people who, for good reason, I keep emphasising this in the book, I hope I do anyway, for good reason, infuriated by Anglo-American policy, say, go along with ideas and arguments and people who would just once have been totally taboo, not least because, the first thing they ever do when they get into power is kill liberals and socialists.
Isn't the Bush government far right? Isn't supporting wars that he wants to prosecute being a fellow traveller with the far right?
Bush government isn't far right in the sense it's a democratic government, bound by a constitution, bound by a Bill of Rights. I'm talking about totalitarian movements of the far right. Supporting Bush's wars may be right-wing, but the problem is because Iraq has been such, for good reason again, has been such a huge thing, and it is a huge thing. It is an extraordinary business. In reviews and writing about my book, all everyone talks about is the Second Iraq War. Well, that's only 2 chapters in my book, both of which begin with me saying that opponents of the war had vast numbers of good points and were right on many things. But what is very, very revealing to me as someone who comes from the left is just the complete lack of support, not just in Britain, but all over the world, with honourable exceptions, for people in Iraq who wanted something better after 35 years of a tyranny that you could describe as fascist. I don't throw that word around lightly. I don't say your dad telling you to get your hair cut is fascist, or a policeman asking you to move along to demonstration is fascist. I mean the full thing. The great leader, the campaigns of ethnic extermination, including with gas, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the wars of foreign aggression. And I knew before the war and got to know better since, Iraqi socialists, Iraqi trade unionists who have just been. It's not just in Britain in particular, you had an anti-war movement led by an extraordinary alliance of the far left and the white far left and the Islamist far right. But the whole liberal world just saying this is illegal, and not thinking for a moment about where that leaves people in desperate circumstances, with the odds probably hopelessly against them, the criminally incompetent administration and Al-Qaeda and the Ba'ath Party, who represent everything that they're a liberal nightmare. They are the ultimate liberal nightmare, blowing the country apart. Where that leaves them, this is illegal, therefore Iraq was a lawful possession of the Baathists, therefore anyone who is trying to build a successor regime is is somehow a receiver of stolen goods. So that's what interests me. That, in some ways, it's fair enough for the critics to go on about that section, but because that's what really got me going when I realised, I was working on the Observer and the New Statesman and very, very sort of right-on London media. And I just realised that it's not that the people around me were not only just not going to, we're going to oppose the war for very good reasons, but we're not even going to stand up for people who share the values. They weren't even going to recognise they exist. They're going to look through them. They're going to pretend they weren't there. And that got me going on the whole thing of, what is your leftism then? What's it mean? Where is it a lifestyle choice? Is it a pose? Is it something you talk about at dinner parties?
Well, it was, and say for, certain people on the left, I think, didn't do that at all. I remember one guy sort of running out in front of Blair's car and holding up a banner saying, "Stop the war, arm the Kurds."
That was Peter Tatchell.
Yes, Peter Tatchell. There were various people who had been long-time campaigners against sanctions, long-time campaigners to get people out of Iraq as much as possible, to make alliances.
Yeah, sure. But and Peter
between Iraqis.
And Peter now has been doggedly doing that, and ever since. But if you move on from the war, just go back through the liberal press, go back through, if you could do, go back through the archives of liberal broadcasters. You can hardly pretend that's typical. You can hardly pretend that there's been any feeling that what's going on in Iraq, somehow European left-wing values or liberal values are at stake, and somehow we have to take sides. People do try to say this. Peter throwing himself in front of the Prime Minister's car is one thing, and the trade union movement, incidentally, has been pretty damn good. Trade union leaders who get out of bed every morning wondering that they hate Bush more than they hate Blair are bringing Iraqis over. They're training them. They're sending aid. They're helping set up unions, which are being, Al Qaeda's killing them because these are. But
liberal journalists have highlighted the tardiness with which a democratic process was set up. They've highlighted the degree to which the Anglo-American forces remain within the green zone and don't know what's really going on. There has been a lot of disclosure, and you may say that the liberal press has ignored Iraqis, but actually it's sort of stayed on the front pages of the liberal press year after year after year.
Sorry. I'm not criticising reporters. What I'm saying is in the very hard case of Iraq, which I accept is about as hard a case as you're going to get.
Well, the case of Iran is quite hard too.
Well, okay.
Where do you stand on that?
Sorry?
Where do you stand on Iran?
Well, in what sense?
Where do you stand on the imminent bombing of Iran?
I'm against it because I don't think it's possible. But on the other hand, I was just reading a guy called Danny Postal from New York who has just done interviews with hundreds and hundreds of people left is a very hard word to use.
Well, yes, there are lots of oppositional movements in Iraq who are desperate for change.
In New York.
In Iran.
No, sorry. Left is a very hard word to use in America. But with liberal-minded people in New York, has written this extraordinary book, just saying, it's fine, obviously you oppose an attack on Iran, but none of them had the slightest conception or support for Iranian feminists, Iranian Democrats, the ethnic minorities in Iran, the Arab minority, the Kurd minority being persecuted. And one reason, my book is an attempt to give reasons for why that might happen, but one consequence of this, which is very, very bizarre, is that Iranian feminists, Muslim feminists in Holland, Kurdish socialists, are, funnily enough, finding the only place they can turn to is American neoconservatives, which is very bad news for them because American neoconservatives aren't actually very good at affecting policy, and that's what interests me. It's not.
Yeah. Well, another funny thing is that in over the past 20 years, one of the few places that Iranian feminists